The wrongful conviction of Kalief Browder, the teen who fought the system. Imagine being 16 years old, walking home from a party with your friend, when police officers stop you on the street. They accuse you of stealing a backpack. You tell them you didn't do it. You have no criminal record. You've never been in trouble before. But instead of going home that night, you're arrested, taken to one of America's most notorious jails, and told you'll have a court date soon. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. You maintain your innocence, refusing to plead guilty to something you didn't do, even as prosecutors offer you deals to go home. You spend 3 years in jail waiting for a trial that never comes, enduring violence, isolation, and abuse. You're finally released when the charges are dismissed, but the damage has already been done. This isn't a dystopian fiction. This is the true story of Kalief Browder, a teenager from the Bronx whose fight against a broken criminal justice system would expose the brutal reality of America's bail system, pretrial detention, and the devastating consequences of being poor and black in a system that presumes guilt rather than innocence. Kalief Browder was born on May 25, 1993, in the Bronx, New York. He was the youngest of 7 children, raised by his mother Vanita Browder in a working-class neighborhood. Life wasn't easy for the Browder family. They struggled financially, moving between apartments, relying on public assistance, navigating the challenges that millions of American families face when living paycheck to paycheck. But Vanita was determined to give her children stability and love. She worked hard to keep her family together, to make sure her kids went to school, stayed out of trouble, and had opportunities for a better life. Kalief was a normal teenager. He liked sports, particularly basketball. He had friends in his neighborhood. He attended school regularly and was working toward his high school diploma. Like many teenagers, he wasn't perfect. He had gotten into minor trouble before, mostly related to joyriding in a stolen vehicle when he was younger, which resulted in probation. But by 16, he was trying to stay on the right path, focusing on school and avoiding the pitfalls that trapped so many young men in his neighborhood. On May 15, 2010, Kalief and his friend were walking home from a party in the Bronx around midnight. It was a Saturday night, and they were just 2 teenagers heading back to their neighborhood after hanging out. As they walked along Arthur Avenue, a police car pulled up beside them. 2 officers got out and told the boys to stop. Someone had reported a robbery, the officers explained. A man claimed that his backpack had been stolen, containing a camera, an iPod Touch, and some cash. The man was in the police car, and he had identified Kalief and his friend as the people who had robbed him. Kalief was confused and frightened. He told the officers he hadn't stolen anything. He didn't have a backpack. He didn't have someone else's property. He and his friend had just been walking home. The officers searched both boys but found nothing, no backpack, no camera, no iPod, no evidence of any crime. But the man in the police car, whose name was Roberto Bautista, insisted that these were the boys who had robbed him. He said the robbery had happened 2 weeks earlier, that Kalief and his friend had threatened him and taken his backpack on the street. Despite having no physical evidence, despite Kalief's denials, despite the fact that the alleged robbery had supposedly occurred 2 weeks prior, making identification highly questionable, the officers arrested both boys and took them to the precinct. Kalief kept insisting he was innocent. He had never seen Roberto Bautista before. He had never stolen anyone's backpack. This was a mistake, a case of mistaken identity, and surely it would be cleared up quickly. But it wouldn't be cleared up quickly. It wouldn't be cleared up at all in any reasonable time frame. What happened next would consume 3 years of Kalief Browder's life, and ultimately contribute to his tragic death. Kalief was charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault. Because he was still on probation from his earlier joyriding case, he was held on bail set at $3,000. For many families, $3,000 might be manageable, an amount that could be borrowed or scraped together. But for Vanita Browder, a single mother supporting multiple children on a limited income, $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. She didn't have it. She couldn't raise it. And so Kalief, presumed innocent under the law, was sent to Rikers Island to await his trial. Rikers Island is New York City's main jail complex, a sprawling collection of facilities on a small island in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. It houses approximately 10,000 inmates at any given time, many of them, like Kalief, pretrial detainees who have not been convicted of any crime but cannot afford bail. Rikers has a notorious reputation for violence, abuse, and inhumane conditions. It is not a prison where convicted criminals serve sentences. It is a jail where people wait, sometimes for months or years, for their cases to be resolved. Kalief was 16 years old when he entered Rikers. He was placed in the Robert N. Davern Center, a facility that houses younger inmates. Almost immediately, he was exposed to violence. Rikers operates with chronic understaffing, inadequate supervision, and a culture where violence between inmates and even between staff and inmates is common. Kalief witnessed assaults, experienced threats, and learned quickly that survival in Rikers required constant vigilance. His case moved through the court system with agonizing slowness. In the American criminal justice system, defendants have a constitutional right to a speedy trial. In New York, this generally means that a felony case should be brought to trial within 6 months. But in practice, cases are routinely delayed through a combination of prosecutorial tactics, court backlog, and systemic dysfunction. Kalief's case was delayed again and again and again. His first court date came and went with the case being adjourned, postponed to a future date. Then another adjournment. And another. Each time, Kalief was told his trial would happen soon. Each time he returned to Rikers to wait. The delays were caused by various reasons that prosecutors and judges cited. Witnesses weren't available, evidence needed to be gathered, the court calendar was too crowded. But underlying all these excuses was a system that had no urgency about resolving the case of a poor black teenager who couldn't afford bail. Kalief's public defender, overworked and managing dozens of cases simultaneously, repeatedly offered him plea deals. If Kalief would just plead guilty, he could go home with time served or a short additional sentence. Many defendants in Kalief's situation take these deals. They plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because the alternative is remaining in jail indefinitely while waiting for a trial. The pressure to plead guilty is immense when you're sitting in Rikers, when every day brings the threat of violence, when you're missing your family and your life and your education, when you're told that trial could be months or years away but you could go home tomorrow if you just say you're guilty. But Kalief refused. He told his lawyer, his mother, and anyone who would listen that he was innocent. He had not stolen that backpack. He would not plead guilty to something he didn't do. This decision, this adherence to principle and truth, would cost him dearly. His refusal to accept a plea deal meant he would remain in Rikers, waiting for his day in court, a day that kept being pushed further and further into the future. As months stretched on, Kalief's situation deteriorated. He was involved in fights with other inmates, sometimes defending himself, sometimes targeted because of his age and relative vulnerability. Officers at Rikers brutalized him on multiple occasions. He was beaten by correction officers, an assault that was captured on security cameras and would later be made public, showing officers punching and kicking Kalief while he was defenseless. After various disciplinary incidents, some provoked by his need to defend himself in the violent environment, Kalief was sent to solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, sometimes called segregation or the box, involves locking a person in a small cell, typically about 6 by 8 feet, for 23 hours a day. There is no programming, no education, minimal human contact. It is a form of isolation that mental health experts describe as torture, particularly damaging to young people whose brains are still developing. Kalief spent approximately 2 years in solitary confinement during his 3 years at Rikers. 2 years of isolation in a cell barely larger than a bathroom, with 1 hour a day to shower or walk in a small area alone, with nothing to do, nothing to read initially, no one to talk to. The psychological effects of this isolation were devastating. Kalief attempted suicide multiple times while in solitary, trying to hang himself with bedsheets in moments of desperation and hopelessness. Outside Rikers, Kalief's mother Vanita was fighting desperately to get her son home. She attended every court date, sitting in the courtroom hoping this would be the day her son would finally get his trial. She wrote letters, made phone calls, pleaded with lawyers and officials. But she was one woman battling a massive, indifferent bureaucracy. She had no money for a private attorney, no political connections, no power to compel the system to act. Kalief's case was adjourned more than 30 times over 3 years. 30 times his trial was postponed. The prosecution's case was weak from the beginning and only grew weaker over time. The alleged victim, Roberto Bautista, had returned to Mexico and could not be located to testify. Without their key witness, the prosecution had virtually no case. But rather than dismiss the charges, they kept requesting delays, hoping Bautista would return or that Kalief would finally accept a plea deal out of desperation. The criminal justice system had no incentive to resolve Kalief's case quickly. He was already in jail, so there was no public safety concern about him being free. The prosecution faced no consequences for the endless delays. The court system was so backlogged that judges routinely granted adjournments without much scrutiny. And Kalief, because he was poor and couldn't afford bail, had no leverage. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare with no way out except to maintain his innocence and wait. After more than 1,000 days in jail, after 3 years of violence, isolation, and psychological trauma, the prosecution finally admitted what should have been obvious from the beginning. They had no case. On May 29, 2013, just after Kalief's 20th birthday, the charges against him were dismissed. The prosecution cited the unavailability of their witness and the insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Kalief was released from Rikers Island after spending 3 years there for a crime he didn't commit, 3 years without ever being convicted, 3 years stolen from his adolescence based on an accusation that was never proven. Kalief returned home to the Bronx, to his mother's apartment, to a life that had continued without him. His friends had graduated high school and moved on with their lives. 3 years had passed, years when he should have been finishing high school, maybe starting college, developing relationships, building a future. Instead, he had been locked in a cage, beaten, isolated, and traumatized. The young man who came home from Rikers was not the same 16-year-old boy who had been arrested. Kalief struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. He had flashbacks to the violence he experienced. He was paranoid about being arrested again. He struggled to sleep, haunted by nightmares. The psychological damage from 3 years of incarceration, particularly the 2 years in solitary confinement, had fundamentally changed him. Despite his trauma, Kalief tried to rebuild his life. He enrolled in community college at Bronx Community College, pursuing his education. He began speaking publicly about his experience, trying to bring attention to the injustices of the bail system and the horrors of Rikers Island. His story attracted media attention, with journalists recognizing that Kalief's case illustrated everything wrong with America's criminal justice system. A profile in The New Yorker brought national attention to his ordeal. Kalief became an advocate for reform, speaking at events, meeting with politicians and activists, sharing his story to try to prevent others from enduring what he had endured. He was articulate and compelling, explaining in interviews how the system had failed him, how being too poor to afford bail had cost him 3 years of his life, how the delays in his case were inexcusable, how the violence and solitary confinement at Rikers were inhumane. But even as Kalief tried to move forward, the trauma continued to overwhelm him. He attempted suicide several times after his release. He was hospitalized for mental health crises. His mother watched helplessly as her son struggled with demons that the system had created. Vanita tried to get him help, but mental health services were inadequate, and the psychological wounds were deep. On October 14, 2013, tragedy struck the Browder family again when Vanita Browder died from complications related to heart disease. Losing his mother, his strongest advocate and the person who had fought hardest for his freedom, devastated Kalief. He had been home only a few months, and now the one person who had never stopped believing in him was gone. Kalief continued trying to cope, living with family members, pursuing his education, working with his attorney to file a civil lawsuit against the city of New York for his wrongful imprisonment and the abuses he endured at Rikers. The lawsuit sought justice and accountability, demanding compensation for the 3 years stolen from Kalief's life and the trauma inflicted upon him. But the weight of his experiences proved too heavy to bear. On June 6, 2015, at the age of 22, Kalief Browder hanged himself outside his family's home in the Bronx. He left no note, but his death spoke volumes about the lasting impact of his ordeal. The system that had imprisoned him for 3 years without trial had ultimately killed him, even after his release. Kalief's death sparked outrage and renewed calls for criminal justice reform. Media coverage intensified, with major news outlets documenting his story in detail. Documentary filmmaker Jenner First produced a 6-part documentary series about Kalief's life and ordeal, bringing his story to even wider audiences. Celebrities, activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens expressed grief and anger about what had happened to this young man. The injustices in Kalief's case were numerous and systemic. First, there was the arrest itself, based solely on the accusation of one person regarding an alleged incident from 2 weeks prior, with no physical evidence and despite Kalief's consistent denials. Second, there was the bail system that kept him incarcerated simply because his family was poor, while wealthier defendants accused of far more serious crimes could buy their freedom while awaiting trial. Third, there were the endless delays in bringing his case to trial, violations of his right to a speedy trial that the system ignored. Fourth, there were the conditions at Rikers Island, the violence, the abuse by correction officers, the 2 years in solitary confinement that amounted to torture. And finally, there was the dismissal of charges after 3 years, an acknowledgement that there had never been sufficient evidence to prosecute him in the first place. Kalief's story illuminated the brutal reality that the American criminal justice system operates as 2 separate systems, one for people with money and resources, another for the poor. Wealthy defendants can afford bail and private attorneys. They rarely sit in jail awaiting trial. Their cases are often resolved quickly. They have advocates and leverage. Poor defendants, disproportionately people of color, languish in jails like Rikers, pressured to plead guilty to crimes they may not have committed, denied effective representation, forgotten by a system that has no incentive to move quickly. In the aftermath of Kalief's death, some reforms were implemented. New York City committed to closing Rikers Island, though that process has been slow and complicated. New York State passed legislation limiting the use of solitary confinement for young people. Bail reform efforts gained momentum, with advocates pushing to eliminate cash bail for many offenses, arguing that freedom should not depend on wealth. In 2019, New York implemented significant bail reform, eliminating cash bail for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. The reform was inspired in part by Kalief's story and the recognition that cash bail was fundamentally unjust. However, the reforms faced political backlash, with opponents blaming them for increases in crime, and some provisions were rolled back in subsequent years. The city of New York settled the civil lawsuit filed on Kalief's behalf, paying $3 million to his estate, an acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted upon him, though no amount of money could compensate for 3 stolen years and a destroyed life. Kalief Browder's story continues to resonate years after his death, because it represents something larger than one individual tragedy. It exposes the machinery of mass incarceration, the criminalization of poverty, the racial disparities in the justice system, and the human cost of policies that prioritize punishment over rehabilitation and procedure over justice. Every day in America, hundreds of thousands of people sit in jails awaiting trial, presumed innocent under law but treated as guilty because they cannot afford bail. Many will plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit just to go home. Many will lose jobs, housing, and custody of their children while incarcerated. The psychological and economic damage of pretrial detention extends far beyond the individuals imprisoned, affecting families and entire communities. Rikers Island, where Kalief suffered so profoundly, remains open as of this writing, though plans for its closure continue to move forward slowly. The facility still houses thousands of people, many of them teenagers and young adults like Kalief was, many of them there simply because they are poor. Violence remains endemic. Solitary confinement, though more restricted than when Kalief was there, continues to be used. The fundamental problems that destroyed Kalief's life persist. Kalief Browder never got his day in court. He never got to confront his accuser or present his defense to a jury. He never got justice in any traditional sense. What he got was 3 years of hell followed by less than 2 years of freedom haunted by trauma before taking his own life at age 22. His story is one of profound injustice, of a system that chews up young people and spits them out, of bureaucratic indifference to human suffering, of the price paid by the poor and powerless in a society that claims to offer equal justice under law. But Kalief's story is also one of courage and principle. He refused to plead guilty to something he didn't do. He maintained his integrity even as it cost him years of his life. He tried, after his release, to transform his suffering into advocacy, to ensure that others wouldn't endure what he had endured. His mother Vanita fought tirelessly for him, never giving up, never accepting that the system's treatment of her son was acceptable or inevitable. The reforms inspired by Kalief's story, imperfect and incomplete as they are, represent his legacy. Every person who is not held on cash bail because they are poor, every young person who is not sent to solitary confinement, every case that is resolved more quickly than Kalief's was, represents a small victory emerging from his tragedy. Kalief Browder should be alive today. He should have had the chance to finish college, to build a career, to fall in love, to raise a family, to live a full life. The system stole that from him. But his story, painful as it is, continues to educate, to inspire outrage, and to motivate efforts to reform a criminal justice system that too often sacrifices individuals on the altar of institutional convenience and treats poverty as a crime deserving of punishment. When we ask ourselves how a 16-year-old boy can be arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack and end up spending 3 years in one of America's most violent jails without ever being convicted, when we confront the reality that this story is not unique but rather representative of countless similar cases that receive no media attention, we are forced to reckon with fundamental questions about justice, equality, and the kind of society we claim to be. Kalief Browder fought the system. He refused to let it break his spirit by forcing him to confess to something he didn't do. But the system broke him anyway through violence, isolation, and psychological torture. His death was not suicide so much as a delayed homicide, the inevitable result of trauma inflicted by a system designed to presume innocence but which in practice presumes guilt, designed to ensure speedy trials but which in practice delays justice indefinitely, designed to protect human dignity but which in practice degrades and destroys it. The question Kalief's story leaves us with is simple but profound. How many more Kalief Browders are sitting in jails right now, maintaining their innocence, waiting for trials that may never come, enduring abuse and isolation, being psychologically destroyed by a system that has forgotten them? And what are we, as a society, willing to do about it? What do you think? Should anyone be held in jail simply because they cannot afford bail? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and remind us that the fight for a more equitable society continues.